I would like to greetings and welcome everyone to today's Roundtable, European Nuclear Deterrence, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So my name is Mahmoud Javadi, and I'm very pleased to moderate this discussion, which is part of the European Consortium for Political Research, ECPR, House Series. So this event is organized by the ECPR in collaboration with the Loop, which is the ECPR's political science blog. So since mid-April, the Loop has hosted a new blog series titled Nuclear Politics Paradox, which I had the pleasure of launching and curating it. So, and just this morning, the Loop published article number 24 within the series. So this means that we have released almost one article every week since the series began. And my colleagues at the Loop and I are working to keep this momentum going, building an evidence-informed and accessible conversation on nuclear politics and its adjacent fields. And this series welcomes balanced and analytical contribution, and I warmly invite you to consider submitting your own work and joining this ongoing discussion by sending me or the Loop an email, and I'll be in touch with you regarding the submission and the idea that you have. So today's event and Roundtable grows directly out of the Nuclear Politics Paradox series, and it's a chance to take some of the arguments off the page and into conversations. And we aim to focus on one of the talks of the town, and that's European nuclear deterrence. So while I'm conscious of the time and I won't preempt what our panelists will discuss, just allow me to briefly say a few words about the theme of the event. So Europe now faces one of its sensitive security questions: how to think about nuclear deterrence at a time when all certainties are fading. So the Franco-British Northwood Declaration, as you might know, signed earlier this year, marked an unprecedented step toward coordination between Europe's two nuclear powers. And it has revived a fundamental debate. If US guarantees become less predictable, can deeper European cooperation fill the gap, or might it create new risks of its own? So behind these strategic questions lie broader political and ethical ones about credibility, about vulnerability, and also about Europe's long-standing commitment to arms control and non-proliferation. So our goal today is not really to settle all these debates and discussions, but to unpack them to the extent possible through global alliance and national perspectives, and also to ask what kind of nuclear order Europe is in fact building. So on this brief note, I would like to introduce our excellent and fantastic speakers. And without further ado, I invite them to deliver their remarks, each for about 10 minutes. And after the opening round, we will have plenty of time for your comments, for your questions, and I'm very much looking forward to an engaging conversation and discussions. So I introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be speaking today. And we'll begin with Dr. Valentina Cassar, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Malta. Her research focuses on nuclear strategy cultures, European security, and the foreign and security policies of the United States and Russia. Next is Julie Decarpentrie, a doctoral researcher in the Department of War Studies at the Swedish Defense University. Julie's work examining nuclear strategy and doctrine with a particular focus on how the French nuclear debate has evolved from the Cold War to the present. Our third speaker, Dr. Linde Desmaele, is Assistant Professor of Intelligence and Security at Leiden University. Linde has held fellowship at MIT Security Studies Program and Columbia University Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And her research has appeared in several leading journals in the field. And last but not certainly least, Dr. Monika is Associate Professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences, part-time professor at the European University Institute in Florence, and a joint faculty member at the Hertie School in Berlin. So I'll be sharing the links to our panelists' articles on the Loop shortly via the message function, and I invite you to give them a read if you haven't done so yet. And you'll also find detailed bio and their social media handles in their webpage and bio sections. So before we start, I have 3 quick housekeeping notes. First, during the speaker's remarks, all participants and microphones will remain off to ensure we can focus fully on their statements. But after the opening round, you're very welcome to join the conversation either by writing your questions or comments in the chat or by turning on your camera and microphone to make an intervention. And finally, this session is being recorded and will later be available on ECPR's website and YouTube channel. So please keep that in mind when contributing. Well, a very warm welcome to everyone and many thanks to our panelists and speakers for making the time to share their insights with us. Thank you, Valentina, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank Mahmoud for his great work in bringing the Nuclear Politics Paradox series together, and also for the very kind invitation to contribute and to participate in this discussion today. It is an extreme honor to be here with Julie and Linde and Monika and yourself, of course. And it's greatly appreciated for keeping the conversation going. So as you know, our topic for discussion today is European nuclear deterrence. And what I'd like to do is begin by mapping out the context for this, and so that we can think about what has changed in the broader international and nuclear security agenda, particularly concerning US-Russia relations and their own nuclear postures, and what has revived both the political and the academic discussions for the need for Europeans, and more specifically the United Kingdom and France, to think about cooperating more closely in this regard. We know that as 2 of the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT, the UK and France have always had a prominent role on this subject, but it has always been the United States and Russia, or previously the United States and the Soviet Union, and their relations that have been at the heart, or like the hypercenter, if you will, of the agenda. But over the past decade, I would say that US-Russian relations have deteriorated, transatlantic relations have been reformed, and the international community has evolved, to say the least, both politically, economically, and even in terms of its security. I'd like to basically then reflect on 4 aspects that have been sources of concern for Europe. So both US posture, Russia's posture, China's evolving posture and role in this subject, and the state of play, if we have time, on non-proliferation and the disarmament agenda. So firstly, with regards to US-Russian relations, we know that the relationship has been at its, if not its lowest, or extremely low, and especially in terms of the New START Treaty, which was signed in 2010, this is on the eve of expiring, and we know that the first Trump administration had stalled in its commitment to extending the treaty, and it's still unclear what the state of play is when it comes to what will happen in the next couple of months when the treaty expires. So I mean, the US perspective of Russia within the US nuclear posture reviews under both the first Trump administration and even under the Biden administration had shifted, where we saw Russia no longer being described as just a nuclear peer, but with its annexation of Crimea, its war against Ukraine, the nuclear saber-rattling, the modernization programs and policy shifts, also led to Russia being described as having reverted back to great power competition. So this has shifted Russia's role in the security outlook, I would say, of the United States, especially in terms of its nuclear posture. And so far, the direction of the current administration regarding bilateral arms control with Russia, as I said, is unclear. The president has often passed skeptical remarks about nuclear weapons and reiterated the need for reductions. And he seems to be reacting positively to President Putin's suggestions a few weeks ago that the commitments under New START could be extended by a year. And in this respect, his less contentious relationship, shall we say, with President Putin and his red carpet welcome might all go well for the resuscitation of the arms control agenda between the two. the other aspect, aside from arms control, that is important to think about is, from a European perspective, is the way that NATO members have had to question their confidence in US extended deterrence and its commitment to Article 5. And this was particularly in the context of the heightened security environment regarding Russia's war in Ukraine and its hostility to NATO. We saw then the increase in defense spending to 5% of GDP over the past couple of months has addressed or appeased some of these concerns. But we're still hearing derogatory remarks about those members who are spending less, specifically with reference to Spain. President Trump recently passed several comments about Spain due to its failure to commit to this 5% benchmark. So this question mark, I would say, at times is still at the back of the minds of European states. I would argue, but I would have more faith in the presence of extended deterrence in US posture, where it remains extremely central and extremely historically ingrained. We saw the 2022 nuclear posture review referring to this repeatedly, stating that integrated deterrence means using every tool at the Defense Department's disposal in close collaboration with counterparts and allies and partners. It prioritizes working with NATO allies to heighten US deterrence, especially in relation to Russia, and emphasizes also assurances to allies and partners within the objectives of US nuclear policy. We don't have as yet a US defense strategy on nuclear posture review, but we can look towards the recent 2023 Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, which provides bipartisan recommendations on the outlook for 2027 and 2035. And the language here is consistently reiterating US partnership with allies and states as well. And here it also does reflect the position that has emerged from both the Trump and the Biden administration's defense strategies and security strategies and nuclear posture reviews with regards to the identification of Russia and China as both being of concern. So, for example, the Commission report states the objectives of US strategy must include effective deterrence and defeat of simultaneous Russian and Chinese aggression in Europe and Asia using conventional forces. It states if the United States and its allies and partners do not field sufficient conventional forces to achieve this objective, the US strategy would need to be altered to increase reliance on nuclear weapons to deter or counter opportunistic or collaborative aggression in the other theater. So we see the emergence of the United States having to divide its attention between concerns of resurgent Russia and China as well. With regard to NATO's deterrence posture, it's primarily reliant on the United States, but it does also refer to the independent force postures of the UK and France, of course. And more than that, I would say it relies on the contributions of member states, notably their infrastructure, their military support, their dual capability aircraft and infrastructure. And we can also look at this week's NATO carried out some nuclear exercises, which involved the participation, if I'm not mistaken, of 14 allies. So we try to see this sort of collaborative effort and this recognition that NATO member states need to be burden sharing with the United States because of this transformed international context and reality. So we know that Russia is depicted in US strategy as being more contentious, but Russia's nuclear deterrence doctrine also perceives and recognizes the allied nuclear threat within its own strategy document. So, for example, the 2024 policy on nuclear deterrence also identified that nuclear deterrence defines Russian nuclear deterrence as being towards a potential adversary, which could be defined as individual states and or military coalitions, so blocs and alliances, and continuously utilizes this language in reference to the role of allies and blocs in supporting a nuclear adversary. Moreover, Russia's foreign policy does also, its foreign policy concept identifies the fact that most European states pursue an aggressive policy towards Russia, which is aimed at creating threats to the security and sovereignty of the Russian Federation, and seeking to destabilize Russia's role and status within the international community. So it does paint a picture of bundling the European states as collaborators with the United States, and as being disruptive to their relationship, or the potential of their relationship. But it does also identify the intention to reassert and maintain its strategic parity and stability within the United States. More troubling, perhaps, or what is the bigger issue, I think, in this state of play is the role of China. So China's emergence does also disrupt Russia's standing as a great power, where I think Russia seeks to assert itself in all the more both at a regional level, but even in collaboration with China. And the United States strategic postures has continuously, over the past couple of years, describes China as the most consequential strategic competitor for the coming decades. And that it has both the intent and the ability to reshape the international order. Over the past decade, we also know that China's nuclear warheads have doubled to reach an estimated 500 to 600. And this is a figure that is expected to double again in the coming years. So with the United States, that is going to be overstretched between having to counter and consider two nuclear potential adversaries, both separately or simultaneously. We do see increasingly the need for European states to reconsider where they can contribute to existing structures, existing policies, existing realities. I think we also need to think about what changes are taking place in the needs and requirements for extended deterrence as well in the Indo-Pacific region, and how that may have a ripple effect on European nuclear deterrence and its role, both in terms of its contribution to NATO's deterrence force posture, but also in terms of the assurances that the United States can provide. And at the same time, it also needs to be considering also as well the status quo within Russia and Ukraine, but also in terms of the domestic political realities within the United States, and how that might be shifting the narratives and the political will within the US to maintain the force postures that it has now. I'm going to stop here for now, Mahmoud, but I'm happy to further elaborate and comment on other aspects later on.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your initial remarks, Valentina. I think you touch upon some overarching topics within the domain and somehow lay the groundwork for other panelists and speakers, maybe to build upon and somehow advance of what you have said. Maybe we can continue our conversations, just inviting Julie to talk, if I'm not mistaken, mostly about Franco-British declarations signed recently, but maybe generally about the European nuclear deterrence at large. Julie, yeah, the mic is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. Really, it's a pleasure to be here, and I can see some of the names I recognize on the list of attendees. So hello, everyone. And hopefully we will have together, I'm sure we will have constructive conversations with the rest of the panelists. I'm looking forward to that. So I will take the next 10 minutes, as you said, to discuss the French and British nuclear approaches, and I will focus more specifically on the Northwood Declaration that was made earlier this year. So while France and the UK have cooperated on nuclear matters before through joint simulation, scientific collaboration, and military dialogues, the Northwood Declaration is the first public commitment to nuclear coordination at a doctrinal level. The aim of this declaration is to ensure that in a future crisis, Franco-British deterrence can function in a more coherent and mutually reinforcing manner, even without a unified command. The declaration reflects a commitment to closer Franco-British nuclear coordination, underlying a move toward greater independence and autonomy from the US. This includes deeper exchanges on deterrence signaling and escalation thresholds of nuclear use. Those areas have been historically remained closely guarded, so it is definitely something to highlight. The British and French, this move is widely seen as a response to the deteriorating European security environment. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, European countries have increasingly sought to bolster their collective defense while simultaneously preparing for a scenario in which US security guarantees might become less, let's say, reliable, particularly under the second Trump administration. Well, it can be argued, and I will argue today, that the declaration sends a stronger signal to US than, let's say, Russia. So some scholars have argued that for Russia, the threat lies in the West, and Valentina will be able to say more about the Russians' perspective of threat. But to make it simple, we can understand then Russia might tend to see us in the same basket and might not really consider that much France and UK declaration per se. I don't think it will change their threat perception greatly. However, for the US, by contrast, this development is likely to be perceived differently. The fact that France is working toward a more independent and autonomous European defense architecture is neither surprising nor new. The French were actually pretty vocal about it the last few years. France officials have long argued that Europe should take more responsibility for its own security, including through greater nuclear coordination. France has always been suspicious of the credibility of the American nuclear umbrella, which explains why the state built its arsenal the way it did. However, the fact that the UK is now officially moving in this direction as well is a significant statement. Given its historic closeness to Washington and NATO, that highlights a shift in strategic realities. I'm not 100% certain that this declaration will have been made without President Trump's aggressive rhetoric toward Europe in early 2025. While Russia remains a significant threat, I'm not questioning that, the possibility of a US withdrawal arguably represents an even greater concern for European states. The idea of a European nuclear deterrent has existed in policy cycles for years. You can easily find it in any kind of strategic debates and whatnot. But it still remains politically controversial. France has traditionally guarded its force de frappe, so its nuclear deterrent, as an expression of national sovereignty, while the UK's nuclear forces rely heavily, or perhaps more heavily, on the US logistical and technical support, at least through the Trident program. Still, by formally coordinating nuclear doctrines, threat perceptions, and response scenario, the new declaration pushes both countries closer to a shared strategic mindset. This is very new. It can be seen as right now quite quiet, but unmistakable foundations for the future European deterrence planning, or at least we can have a view of the future. Saying that, the UK and France has made it categorically clear that the Northwood Declaration is intended to complement, not replace NATO. It is very difficult to argue that the French and the British nuclear arsenals alone, without the support of the US, will be sufficient to actually create a credible deterrence toward Russia. Currently, the UK holds approximately 225 nuclear warheads, while France is believed to maintain around 290. So, as a reminder, Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, with estimates ranging from approximately 4,000 something and 5,580 warheads in total stockpile. It really depends which sources you're looking at. But what is roughly agreed upon is that 1,700 strategic warheads are deployed across its nuclear triad of land-based missile, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bombers. Neither France or the UK can claim comparable capabilities, nor they don't have the finance to do it, they don't have the capacity to do it, and this is not the long-term plan. The French force de frappe consists of two components, the air and the sea. This is designed to ensure maximum independence from the US while maintaining a credible deterrent posture to safeguard the state's vital interest. France is a member of NATO, but continues to refuse joining NATO's nuclear planning group in order to maintain its autonomy and independence. The UK nuclear deterrence is based solely on the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, what we call the SSBNs, forming a single component. The sea-based nuclear force maintains what we call a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrence. That means then at least one submarine is at sea, one SSBN is at sea at all time, protecting the second strike capability. So unlike France, the UK closely integrates its nuclear planning with the US and NATO. Neither state, France or the UK, host American nuclear weapons on its territory, and both maintain a full operational control over their respective arsenal. So it's not because the UK is closely integrated its nuclear planning with the US, then they are dependent on the US. Sometimes you can hear things about that, but it's not true. They are fully independent in the control of the nuclear weapons. The UK's missiles, although produced in the US, remain under British command. France, consistent with its long-standing emphasizing on autonomy, manufactures all components of its nuclear deterrence domestically. So despite a few differences, France and the UK have much in common. Both rely on what I mentioned, the continuous at-sea deterrent, and they base their doctrines on the concept, that's very much of a British concept, of minimum deterrence. The French call it differently, but the idea is the same, making their nuclear deterrent approach quite compatible when you think about it. So to go to the point, when you ask me, is stronger Franco-British nuclear collaboration beneficial for deterrence credibility? Arguably, yes. It reinforces the political willingness behind the deterrence through clear communication, which is essential for credibility. That's deterrence theory 101. If such collaboration were expanded to include coordinated nuclear exercises, it will further enhance capacity and readiness. In essence, the Franco-British nuclear cooperation strengthened Europeans' deterrence credibility. However, and that's, I think, will very much link to what Valentina just mentioned, both countries must be a little bit careful not to play with fire by alienating the US. And in this way, I would make especially France. France should be cautious in advancing a strong narrative on autonomy and independence. Washington has already made clear its desire to shift focus away from Europe toward other priorities, such as China, but Valentina also mentioned other places. Additionally, in the current context, it is uncertain how the American president might react, and we do not want to risk pushing the US completely out. It would be detrimental to European security if France and the UK inadvertently encouraged the US disengagement. Because when you think about it, as it stands today, the French and the British deterrent will not be as credible, or not credible perhaps at all, against Russia on their own. And so, despite what the British and the French, some of the British and the French might think, Europe still very much need the US for the security. And hopefully, in the future, they will consider that when they articulate their official statement. Coming back from, I just flew back from Paris a couple of days ago, and they are talking about the new presidential speech to be held by Emmanuel Macron early 2026. The speech is currently being articulated. So let's see what they say. Let's see what words they choose. And yeah, if you want to talk about that later, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Julie. I think that you perfectly and brilliantly touch upon the very recent, but at the same time, one of the most salient issues across European nuclear deterrence and about this declaration. Of course, there, at least to me, there are maybe one or two provocative statements that I really like it. So maybe that also paved the way for further discussions and elaboration on that during the Q&A session. However, this is my general question maybe to all, that I think it's good to also think about the spillover effects, positive and negative. And I think Linde and Monika will touch upon that angle mostly within Europe, but in terms of somehow non-nuclear allies across Europe. But also maybe we can extend these discussions and conversations across the world, how non-European will understand and will react to that declaration, but also generally to NATO and also to transatlantic relationship when it comes to nuclear deterrence. So for now, maybe we stick to non-nuclear allies across Europe, just by inviting Linde, kindly sharing her remarks and insight. And then we continue with Monika by focusing mostly on Eastern European and Polish context on this very same topic. So Linde, thank you very much for joining, and we're all ears to have your remarks.
Thank you very much for having me also, and for organizing this roundtable. So indeed, what I will do in my remarks is offer a little bit of a non-nuclear viewpoint, so not the non-nuclear viewpoint, just a non-nuclear viewpoint, because I'm very curious also to hear what Monika will have to say, and I'll focus very specifically on kind of the evolving role of nuclear weapons in both deterring adversaries as well as reassuring allies in Europe, but really kind of in light of some of the knowledge that we now have about our own nuclear history, as well as the challenging kind of present circumstances we face. And in that regard, I really want to kind of focus my remarks by drawing your attention on one assumption, an implicit assumption that I have the impression structures a lot of the debates on the future of nuclear deterrence and reassurance in a European context, and also in the spirit of, having a constructive debate, an assumption that perhaps needlessly constrains our imagination as to what deterrence might look like going forward. And that is the specific assumption that effective deterrence basically requires nuclear escalation options. So the assumption that for deterrence and extended deterrence in particular to be credible, one kind of needs some sort of diverse tactical nuclear weapons that can be used for limited or local nuclear strikes, so to be able to respond in kind to an adversary across a spectrum of conflict And so to be able to participate or master some sort of an escalation ladder. And so what I would like to do is first kind of briefly explain where the centrality of this assumption to much of the current discourse comes from. And then second, and this is where perhaps a little bit more controversially, but again, I'm offering these thoughts really in the spirit of having a debate. Also explain why I think we might want to let go of this assumption and how, if we do that, that might actually open up space to think more creatively about what credible European deterrence might actually look like going forward. So first, why kind of this focus on deterrence requiring credible nuclear escalation options? So very straightforwardly, since the very early years of the Cold War, NATO allies have fundamentally relied on a deterrence and defense posture, or a deterrence and a defense concept that is premised on the assumption that nuclear deterrence will hold. And within this framework, non-nuclear allies simply face enduring structural fears of abandonment, so doubts about whether their nuclear armed allies in the NATO context, in particular the United States, will really come to their aid, including by using nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. Now, we definitely see that there's more attention being paid to these fears of abandonment today again, but I still think it's important to note that it is also somewhat misleading to attribute such anxieties about US reliability to only kind of the idiosyncrasies of particular US administrations, including the current one. Because if we look at NATO's history, concerns about, abandonment, about credibility are not new, they're not exceptional, they've always been there. And they're to a large extent just intrinsic to the very logic of extended nuclear deterrence, because there's always just going to be some ambiguity, some uncertainty about whether any nuclear patron would really risk nuclear retaliation on their own territory to defend an ally, because there's just an asymmetry between defending one's own territory and defending the territory of an ally that can never be fully ignored or fully eliminated. And this, I think, is important context because, importantly, the United States has, over the decades, taken a number of steps to address this problem of credible deterrence and allied reassurance, and so to convince both its allies as well as its adversaries that its extended nuclear deterrent is indeed real and is indeed credible. And in the 1960s, this basically led NATO to adopt a strategy called flexible response. So basically, this is a strategy initially developed to deal with the threat of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And basically, the logic says that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, NATO would first respond with conventional forces to push back the invasion. If that was not enough, NATO would then rely on tactical nuclear weapons, so small, short-range, limited nuclear weapons based in Europe. And then only if that proved insufficient, strategic nuclear weapons, high-yield intercontinental ballistic missiles and the like could be considered and relied upon as a last resort. But this was really designed to make US nuclear threats on behalf of its allies more credible by showing that the United States has options short of all-out nuclear war, because the threat of all-out nuclear war was just generally deemed kind of not proportionate or not credible in response to a quote-unquote limited incursion, let's say. And so this flexible response and this notion of having escalatory options, being able to fight a limited nuclear war, was really kind of supposed to allow the United States to threaten nuclear use on Europe's behalf without immediately risking its own homeland, because it was basically the solution to the credibility problem, because it allows the United States to fight a contained, a localized nuclear war elsewhere. And then if we now fast forward to today, this logic of fighting a localized nuclear war elsewhere, I think, is still very much shaping of debates. And we definitely see this in arguments about if the United Kingdom and France want to replace or perhaps complements, the United States' commitment that they somehow need more options, that they need low-yield tactical options for their kind of commitments to be deemed credible. Because the idea is then, well, if they don't have the ability to fight limited nuclear war near the front lines, let's say in the Baltics, their deterrence will not be credible. And so limited nuclear options are really needed to enable a contained nuclear response near the conflict zone, because in that way, they would then be able to prevent escalation to the point where their leaders must actually consider trading Paris or London for, let's say, Tallinn. And that kind of brings me to the second part of my remarks, where I just would like to make the point that really kind of doubling down on this logic of flexible response and the idea that we, NATO, need kind of plans for limited nuclear war for deterrence to work. I think if we really stick to this, it really limits our strategic imagination for two kind of main reasons. First, because the very concept of a limited, contained, localized nuclear war is very controversial, because it's difficult to predict what any kind of such a conflict would look like and whether it's even possible to prevent a nuclear war from escalating. Because once a nuclear weapon is used, even a low-yield one, it might turn out very hard to prevent things from spiraling out of control. Maybe it is possible, maybe it is not possible. We just don't have any real-world data on this. And it's also partially because of this uncertainty that planning for such a contingency and planning for such scenarios has always been fraught with a lot of political and operational challenges within NATO. And so limited nuclear options are by no means a silver bullet to the extended deterrence problem. They are a risky gamble, and whether one wants to take that gamble is a normative question. It's one that ought to be the subject of political debates. But there's a little bit of tendency to take this approach as a successful recipe for granted. And that, I think, ought to be much more the topic of discussion, because there are a lot more unknowns to this than one might sometimes get the impression. And then secondly, and I think this is kind of crucial, is that there's also a growing body of research that shows or that suggests that certain advanced conventional weapons can today do many things that we once thought were only possible to do with nuclear weapons. So these types of advanced weapons weren't available at an acceptable political and financial cost during the Cold War, but perhaps they are today. An example here are long-range precision strike systems. A lot of non-nuclear allies are also acquiring these. They can strike military targets deep inside adversary territory. They can even threaten adversary nuclear forces if this is something that one would want to do. They can contribute to missile defense. So basically, these weapons are non-nuclear, but they can also escalate both horizontally as well as vertically. And so that's why I think that in kind of addressing the question of what Europe's deterrence architecture might look like or might have to look like, rather than really fixating on nuclear force structure or somehow trying to replicate the American umbrella, I think it might be more productive to focus on some of the tools that European countries already, or at least in part already have at their disposal, because I think there is really a case to be made, or at the very least a case to be assessed more in detail, that advanced conventional weapons are more usable, politically more credible, less escalatory, and importantly, they also allow just for better burden sharing and better risk sharing, because they are available to a broader range of allies, and they turn the conversation into something that can happen at an alliance level rather than be primarily confined to the nuclear armed states. And so that's why I think that kind of with these remarks, I'm hoping to perhaps kind of partially reframe the question on the future of European deterrence, because the nuclear problem is just one dimension and one part of a broader strategic problem. And the broader strategic problem is how to deter and defend against a revisionist, a risk-tolerant, risk-acceptant Russia. But nuclear here, I don't think it's the starting point. I think it's really the end point. And so rather than starting by asking what nuclear capabilities NATO might need, I think the first question really ought to be what NATO allies can do with conventional and advanced non-nuclear systems. And only once that has been done, which again, I think will especially contribute to the burden sharing agenda, there is a question to be asked as to kind of whether nuclear weapons are needed and for what purpose exactly. But I think the order should perhaps be the other way around. But again, happy to discuss and hear any strong disagreements in the Q&A if there's an interest. So I think I'll stop here and thank you all for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, I mean, we're all very much looking forward to any disagreement, but who knows, maybe the next speaker actually somehow disagree with your statement. No, I'm just joking. So, but certainly Eastern European and Polish understanding, I think, should be quite different, and I think that's a nice and somehow comparative understanding of the nuclear deterrence, and very much looking forward to Monika's comment in between. I would like just to make two quick comments. One is that immediately after Monika's remarks, I'd like to open the floor somehow for any comments, particular comments. I'm very insisting on this point. It's great to have your question, but I think it's also great to have your comments and feedback on any remarks or anything that you would like to add. And I just ask my colleague Abby if you kindly give access for any mic or camera after Monika's remarks. And the second point, I just want to clarify that for Julie's comment, I said provocative. I just want to say that please take it as a somehow with positive connotation. So it's not bad. I think that's great that you made some provocative statement, and I wish I could do in my research, but yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Linde, once again, and warm welcome to Monika. I'm very much looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud, and thank you all. I mean, excellent speakers before me, and I am super happy to actually speak at the end of this short intervention session, because I think I can actually build on many things that you've said, and I would love to disagree with Linda just for the sake of the conversation, but I'm afraid I can't really. So I am not speaking on behalf of Poland, obviously, but I'm just sharing with you some of the observations that together with some co-authors, we kind of developed over the last 3 years on how Poland sees the question of nuclear deterrence. But let me start by saying that one of the reasons, and I know that Linda knows this very well because we used to attend the same workshops, right? Was that, you know, Poland for a very long time, especially before the full-scale invasion, was actually really focused on conventional deterrence, thinking that, and I think this is really something that basically all of the governments in Poland shared over the years, that the conventional deterrence is something that NATO should focus on, especially on the eastern flank. And the nuclear deterrence and the whole debate about that was really, really pushed aside for quite a long time. And the observation that actually we started to look at, and that was basically the starting point for the research, was that something has changed in the Polish debate, and the change is quite profound by now. So I will, as you already could see, I will focus really only on the Polish case. I won't really tackle the other Central Eastern European countries, because I do think that the Polish case is quite specific and quite different from the other countries. Also because you don't really hear other countries on the eastern flank saying that they would like to join NATO nuclear deterrence program, right? And this is something that Poland has been doing for quite some time. But let me start again by saying that a topic of nuclear deterrence has been for quite some time really not even a peripheral topic, but really a taboo in the Polish debate. There was a couple of statements, or there were a couple of statements of Polish politicians, 2014. So once Crimea has been annexed by Russia, you know, mentioning that maybe there is time to actually update NATO's nuclear posture without actually providing any details on that. But they were very quickly silent, actually, both in Poland, obviously, because this topic was really seen as taboo, as I just said, but also by the US administration, because obviously the decision who joins a NATO nuclear sharing program is not something that Poland can do, right? This is all on Washington. And that's something that, of course, is very clear to the Polish policymakers. But then after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, something really shifted in the Polish debate, and Polish leaders And really, I am talking about leaders from the government before 2023, so right-wing government, and then also the government that we are currently having in Poland, so right-wing and now liberal governments. They're actually quite openly talking about Polish willingness, how they call it, to join NATO's nuclear sharing program. And recently, and this is something that Julie elaborated upon, with France basically opening the discussion about potentially providing nuclear deterrence in a long-term scenario, obviously, to some European allies. Poland immediately jumped on board, and basically the Prime Minister Donald Tusk said, yes, we would be interested in that as well. But of course, and this is something, again, that many of the previous speakers underlined, the same is true also for Poland. The US is still the guarantor of security on the eastern flank from the Polish perspective, and this has to be said. So even Donald Trump, although I will refer to that in a second, but even his administration has not really changed the opinion of the Polish policymakers and the society regarding not only the nuclear, let's say, guarantees, but broader question on security guarantees for Europe. So what we see in Poland is really a shift. I wouldn't perhaps call it a shift in strategic culture, but I would call it an element of the strategic culture is moving towards something much more, let's say, pronounced. But there is definitely a shift in public attitudes toward nuclear deterrence. So I will briefly touch upon these two issues. But before I do that, let me again briefly, because of the time, basically sketch the debate that we have been having in Poland for quite some time now. So I mentioned that basically 2022 was the year when the Polish politicians started to talk about nuclear sharing agreements and arrangements, and many times different politicians mentioned that with basically Russia posing such a threat for Poland, including very publicly and very openly threatening Poland with nuclear attacks, we have to think about how to basically reassure that the eastern flank, including Poland, is safe, and perhaps really rethink how NATO nuclear posture can be reformed against the Russian threat. But in the beginning, I would say, of 2020, 2022, and then also in 2023, it was seen by many, especially also by the Polish experts, as more or less a symbolic reassurance measure, meaning basically to make a statement about, that NATO is still there, and perhaps, NATO should somehow reconsider basically going farther with NATO nuclear sharing program, but they weren't really very, precise statements coming from the Polish politicians. This changed in June 2023, when the then Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki quite openly, in a very blunt words, actually in Brussels, said that, well, times are as they are, Russia is threatening Poland, and this is really the time for us to basically join NATO nuclear sharing program. And then with the election of Donald Trump, and with the, let's say, uncertainty that Trump's administration brought the transatlantic commitments, the discussion has even deepened, I would say. So there are still politicians in the government saying that they still pursue, although behind closed doors, discussions with Americans about, potentially extending nuclear deterrence program to Poland. But on the other hand, and at the same time, there's also bilateral talks happening with France, and I think that was President Macron who delivered remarks about the potential European nuclear umbrella. That was actually something that Poland was very keen on hearing. And this is not something that really deepens the cooperation on nuclear issues, but more broadly on security and defense cooperation. France and Poland signed a bilateral treaty in June this year. And this is something that also, at least in the Polish press here, was kind of, packed into this whole idea of perhaps, closing ranks with France, if it comes to that. And finally, and this is my last remark in this part, at the very far end of the debate in Poland, we also have politicians and experts that have begun to speculate about Poland eventually developing its own nuclear capabilities, if US guarantees were to weaken, or if, France or Britain's basically proposals were not enough. So this is not something that you hear every day, but there are even public opinion research, and there is actually I would say it's still, on the margins of the debate, but there is a debate about that. And there are even experts that, run some exercises by calculating how many years it would take or how much money would it cost. So I would still call it a bit, exotic as it comes to the debate, but definitely there's a part of the conversation that is going on this topic too. And of course, on the broader picture, we don't have time to elaborate on that, but definitely this is something that would, be very dangerous for different reasons for different parts of the world, obviously. But let me briefly talk about causes and drivers of this shift, and I think I won't spend much time on that. I would rather spend a bit more of my time on the public opinion. But about causes and drivers, basically three main issues. The one is self-explanatory. It's basically Russia. Not only the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but also really the nuclear blackmail that Poland has been target of. And of course, but I mean, we're talking, in an expert circles here. So we are all very much aware about Russians' deployment of weapons in Belarus. And this all created a sense of vulnerability if it comes to Polish security. And so this is the one of the major reason. Then the second reason about, that actually led to deepening of the debate, and again, reaching out to or welcomed the reach that France has done towards Poland, is a growing distrust towards the durability of US security guarantees. Again, this is something that you don't hear very, I would say, vocal in the Polish debate. You rather hear this behind closed doors, because the official line of the Polish government has been, and I think it will for the foreseeable future always be, we believe in the US security guarantees. This is basically, like the state of the reason in Poland, and definitely there is an increasing number of politicians starting to actually doubt that, but again, this is rather happening behind closed doors. But there's also a third reason that I think it's sometimes perhaps a bit underplayed by some, especially foreign researchers, and this is the question of status and agency. So after providing such a huge help to Ukraine on a continuous measures, basically Polish politicians have opened the conversation about Poland aspiring to be a co-producer of deterrence, and not only basically a country that gets deterrence from the others, but also a country that would like to contribute to deterring of the eastern flank, not only by spending 5% of GDP on defense, not only via buying equipment and producing weapons here, but also by basically shaping the strategic agenda, including the nuclear matters. So I think that's equally important, I would say. There are also some domestic, or even more domestic politics, I would say, behind that. But since the time is almost over, I won't elaborate on that now. But if you're curious, I can also touch upon that in the Q&A. Now, briefly about the public opinion, just to give you a couple of numbers and to show you, hopefully, that, this is a significant thing that is happening here in Poland. So, first of all, let's say that starting with December 2024, one of the public opinion agencies here in Poland pulled in a very, I would say, extensive study on different questions on nuclear sharing. One of the questions they asked was whether Poles support the idea of joining nuclear sharing program. 45% actually of Poles supported. 40%, so this is really also, quite a significant number, oppose it, and 16% had no opinion. But at the same time, over half of Poles believed that participation in NATO nuclear sharing would make Poland safer. So this is definitely something that perhaps is not, so controversial for Poland. But if you recall debates in Belgium, Italy, and especially Germany over the years, whether actually hosting US nuclear weapons make the country secure and less secure, then the number is definitely, I would say, interesting, at least. And this is something that, to be quite frank with you and putting, out my expert hat for a moment, is quite worrying for me. Half of Poles, so really 49% of Poles actually said that they are in favor of Poland developing its own nuclear weapons. And only 30% said no to the question. So again, we shouldn't overestimate, public opinion polls, definitely. And definitely there is more that has to be, explained about that too and put into the context. But I think that combined also with other numbers that we see from the recent polls in 2025, the numbers actually got even higher. So 55% of polls in February 2025 said that Poland should think about having its own nuclear weapons. And this was actually explained by the uncertainty of the transatlantic commitments coming from the Trump administration. So I am not saying, that this is something that Polish governments would do, but definitely fear of Russia, of the Russian escalation remains the major point here. And this is also quite nicely seen in the data, because many of these questions also obviously combine the question whether Poles fear a Russian nuclear attack, and almost 70% of Poles actually fear that Russia can attack Poland with help of nuclear weapons, right? So this is something that we should definitely take seriously. And now, just wrapping up, I definitely one could say that we are having something that we can call normalization of hard security thinking in Poland. And before February 2022, hard security thinking in Poland basically meant investing in defense, buying off shelf from the United States mainly, and also perhaps modernizing the Polish army. But now there's another dimension to that. So we are not only talking about conventional deterrence, we really have started talking about nuclear deterrence too. And this is now something that you can basically find in every strategic document of the Polish government and of the Polish armed forces, that we have to talk about, some dimension of nuclear deterrence, that we basically, that's the statement that you can find that has been neglected for quite some time by NATO and by Poland. So again, there's no silver bullet solution to that all, but I just wanted to basically, to talk a bit about how these things are seen in Poland. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monika. I think that was brilliant overview and some critical thinking on Polish context, and but also domestic policy. But actually, one of my questions, if time allows, I have one question in that regard, and I think that you postponed it to the Q&A, and I hope that we have time to address that part as well. But yeah, that was brilliant. So we have around 20/25 minutes for Q&A and any intervention from the audience, but at the same time, from our panelists and the speakers, if you have any comments in regard to your peers and your colleagues' remarks and statements, yeah, please feel free to share your opinion. In the meantime, if anyone from the audience would like to raise any questions or share his or her comment, I think that you are allowed from the Zoom's issue, that I think that you can turn on camera or mic if you don't mind, and then you can just share your opinion. So maybe I can start with questions from the chat by Alex. So maybe I just read it aloud. That thank you all. If I may put my overlapping questions somewhat provocatively, how should we expect Russia or China to react to this evolving nuclear development among NATO members? And also, so there are a couple of questions, maybe, but I think that's a very good one. And this is what I was thinking that maybe we can discuss. I think it's partly addressed by Valentina, but maybe we can broaden the conversation on this question. So anyone would like to address these questions, please feel free to jump in. Yeah, Valentina, yeah, why not? Yeah, please go ahead. And then I think, Linde, you would like to say something? Yeah, good.
I can try. I think, so when we think about China and Russia's reaction to developments among NATO members, I think, I think they're sort of far ahead of the game. I think Russia, especially, China is taking of its own modernization and its growth in its capabilities and seeking to reach parity with the United States and Russia. I think Russia is focusing primarily on its own modernization, as I think Julie was mentioning the figures, right? You know, we see Russia's the country that has the most warheads. But more than that, what it is focusing on is what it has been focusing on for the past couple of years is its modernization of capabilities. So there is that element of sort of competitiveness, but also always seeking to maintain parity with the United States. And I think China is trying to reach that parity, and Russia is trying to secure its status. I think China and Russia realize that as countries that are working more together, that NATO members are far behind. So there's the United States, but the United States is going to have to split its capabilities. So I think to a certain extent, their approach, intentionally or unintentionally, will overstretch NATO members in that sense. So I think their efforts are focused more on reshaping and reshifting the international nuclear order. Not just the international nuclear order, but also the international liberal order that has been constructed over the past 70, 80 years, which the United States has championed, but so had other European actors, but have also sort of abandoned this, I would say, in the past 10 years, and have not maintained sufficiently the international liberal order. So I think Russia's and China's view are on approaches are on disrupting, I would say, this international liberal and nuclear order that the United States has tried to maintain over the past couple of years. So I think they will be paying attention to what NATO members are doing, but they're still far ahead, I would argue.
Excellent. So yeah, Linde, just maybe one quick comment. I received a comment from Elliot that he said that he couldn't find a raise hand function. So I was thinking that I'm tech savvy, but apparently I'm not. I think that next to React, there is a just arrow, and if you click on that, that should work. Otherwise, Zoom is very new to me, so I will certainly make sure that I read your commentary questions after Linde's comment. Yeah, sorry, Linde, please.
No, thank you. I wanted to touch upon the part of the question about whether an accelerated arms race is making us all secure, and whether that's the only response we can imagine. Because I think that's a very good question, and I think that brings in a very important point that we haven't really touched upon yet, but that we really should in broader conversations about Europe's security architecture, because there's a lot of focus on spending more and on buying more, and there's maybe a little bit of a capability bias in some of the debates. But of course, all of this needs to be part of a strategic concept, of a reflection as to what you are deterring, what you're trying to achieve, but also how you're going to make sure that bad things, so to speak, do not happen, and how you're going to prevent unwanted escalation, how you're going to do risk reduction, and so on. Because deterrence as such, I don't think we should think as deterrence as a goal. Deterrence is ultimately a means. It's a means towards achieving some sort of a political outcome. And we can assume that here this political outcome might be stability. In the near term, probably not peace, but maybe stability should be kind of the outcome that we're working towards. And for that to be really workable, and also through history, there needs to be kind of a complementary side to this, where you have the deterrence side on the one hand, but where you also have the off-ramps and the arms control side on the other hand, and the confidence building measures on the other hand. And this is something that nowadays is politically perhaps less easy, and it's less obvious how that conversation would go and what could be part of that conversation, but it is still there. We've also seen it, I think Valentina mentioned it, with kind of the Russian proposal to potentially extend New START by 1 year. So I think this question that is asked here really goes to the need to have the deterrence conversation as part of a broader political discussion, and as a broader kind of approach that also includes an arms control side and an agenda for how to kind of prevent unwanted escalation, prevent inadvertent escalation, and to really have also kind of some safeguards and some risk reduction measures in place. And that hasn't really been part of our conversation yet today, but it's something that I'm personally also very interested in. And I really think even if today might not be the political moment to have that at the top of the agenda, we should really start thinking about that at the very least today, for when perhaps the political context and the political climate allows us to be moving in towards that direction. So I don't think that just racing faster than the other is the solution, nor should it be the only thing we talk about. So I definitely think that's an excellent point that Alex, if I may, made. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. So Elia, would you like to share your comments or questions? And feel free to turn on your camera. Yeah, nice. That's great.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the speakers. For me, actually, deterrence is a quite new topic of research. So I found it very, very useful what you've been saying today. And my question is basically what I wrote in the chat. So very briefly, what are the risks of the rise of stability and stability paradox in Europe? I leave this open to any speaker who would like to answer to this. But I mean, seeing that in the context of India and Pakistan, we still have the problem that both countries have nuclear weapons, but as this spring demonstrated, risk for armed violence between the two exists. So I was wondering what would be the factors and the risk for a rise of such a situation in Europe, given that I guess for us it's more important to avoid war altogether than just engage in violence under the nuclear threshold. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So anyone would you like to intervene?
I can go, but I'm very happy to leave the floor to the other speakers because I already spoke.
Go ahead and we can build on you.
Okay. Great question. I was actually reading about the stability-instability paradox this morning, so it's very much on my mind as well. And I think, referring back to kind of some of the literature that exists on this, there's just a kind of fundamental disagreement. So this notion that, okay, you might have deterrence at the strategic level, but that might kind of encourage kind of lower level violence, right? So that there's some sort of a paradox. And there's really no consensus among scholars as to whether the presence of such a stability-instability paradox, whether it increases the risk of war or not. So some say that it does. And that's why they say, well, precisely because of this paradox, the risk of war is higher. And so you really need to dominate escalation across the full spectrum. You need to kind of be able to deter your adversary at every level of the escalation ladder to prevent that from happening. But others, however, an alternative view is that basically an alternative view really focuses a lot more on some of the inherent uncertainty in escalation. So basically, because a decision maker can never be really certain that even a seemingly limited conflict would remain contained. And so the fact that there's always this possibility or this prospect of uncontrollable escalation, of inadvertent escalation into a strategic exchange should really kind of induce some level of restraint into how countries behave and thereby reduce the likelihood of aggression. So there's kind of two scholarly views as to whether the presence of such a paradox increases the likelihood of conflict or decreases the likelihood of conflict. But then coincidentally this morning I was reading about this, and there's also some more recent research that looks into certain factors that might impact whether it's more likely or less likely, and so contextual factors. And here the authors, it is a piece written by Hendrik Lim and his co-author, and I really appreciate for the second name slipping my mind here, but they really also emphasize the importance of geographic contexts in how the instability context plays out. And so they basically argue that in a land theater, which is, for example, the case of Europe, because you have kind of small geographical distances, a dense alliance network, it's harder to keep a war limited, whereas in a maritime theater, which is what they look into in the Indo-Pacific, they argue that maybe because it's harder to project power, because the distances are larger, it might be, quote unquote, deemed easier to keep wars limited. So geography is now kind of also a factor that comes into play. And then there's also certain technological developments that are worth looking into. So to what extent kind of specific weapon systems allow one to kind of discriminate whether it's a nuclear missile and a conventional missile, to what extent maybe certain command and control setups are more fragile or less fragile. So there's no scholar, this is a very kind of nerdy answer to your question, but I would say that there's kind of two scholarly views on this. Some say more likely, some say less likely. And now more recent research has started looking into some of the contextual factors that play with both the geography and technology as kind of two factors that have been flagged as relevant. And especially the geography part in the specific case of Europe, because of the density of the theater and because of the density of the alliance network, making actually the prospect of keeping a war limited, perhaps all things equal, rather unlikely. But that's also one kind of perspective that I'm citing here. So I'm hoping that kind of somehow answers your question.
Thank you. Can I ask you to share the name of the publication in the chat so that I can look?
Yes, of course. I'm very happy to, because I also want to kind of give credit where credit is due. I will share it in the chat.
Thanks.
Excellent to both of you. Thank you so much. So Frank, over to you. Yeah, nice.
Hey, thank you. Hope you can hear me all right. I suppose I have a question to Julie, and that is related to the Northwood Declaration. So I was wondering what sort of the limits or maybe the red lines in terms of French-UK nuclear cooperation are from a French perspective, because the UK, they've sort of integrated their nuclear forces within NATO, but there's also the independent option, of course. But for France, as far as I know, sort of the indigenous independent deterrent is something really, really important. So where do you sort of see the red line in terms of the Northwood Declaration? Is it more like a talking shop? Do you think that maybe they would even sort of discuss nuclear doctrines, or maybe even targeting plans, maybe even develop joint targeting plans, or is this like a bridge too far? So where's sort of, how far can this go? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Frank. By the way, nice to see you. Well, that's a very good question, and I don't think a lot of people can actually reply that. I think the leaders are probably the one that can actually answer your question. I don't have the feeling that this is just a declaration. I think there is a political willingness, arguably, on both sides to do more. So I'm not sure if it's I'm pretty sure it's public, but I don't know if it has been public in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. But several times a year, the French are conducting a nuclear exercise called the Poker Operation, which is a simulation of what we call a warning strike. It's an exercise done by the air component of the force de frappe. And now for like a little while, there have been arguments about opening this French exercise with maybe international participants. Everything when it comes to the French declarations are very, very loose and always open to interpretation, to keep the door open to flexibility, shall I say. So we might see in the future more and more nuclear exercises together with the British. We might also see maybe cooperations in modernization, regardless on the conventional side or the nuclear side. So the idea also, and this is something then the French and the British has been working on for a little while together. It's about trying to frame a little bit an understanding of what is the vital interests of each country. France has been cornered several times about the ambiguity of the definition of the French vital interests. This is one of the way they can highlight what kind of vital interests are they talking about. So the term vital interest in the declaration is used several times. They say a joint vital interest or something like that. So no, to me this is not just a political declaration. I think more how can I say that, down to earth things will happen in the future. It will heavily depends on the future leaders of each countries. President Macron right now, as everybody knows, is not in the right place domestically. So it might be complicated for the current government to move on with that. I don't know. We have the elections coming next year, or sorry, the year after, but the campaign starts next year. So so let's see. But in terms of the limitation, I think both sides have like some kind of limitation. On one side will be perhaps the perceived dependence of the UK deterrence toward the US. And on the other side, on the French side, it's this heavily, this strong point of view of independence and autonomy. So there is a little bit of a clash right now in the French discourse. It's like on one side, there's a strong narrative on independence and autonomy. And on the other side, they are opening up to Europe. So there's something going on there. And just to make it clear, the French government does not offer any nuclear umbrella or extended nuclear deterrence. This is what the other country hear, but that's not what the French are saying. What are the French saying? I don't know. They are opening up a dialogue to discuss maybe nuclear talks, but they are not offering nuclear sharing.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much. So I think that probably we need to slightly wrap up, but I'd like to take final comments and remarks from the speakers, and maybe we could do the reverse order and starting by Monika. If you have final and concluding comments, that would be great, including that domestic politics or anything that has been raised during the Q&A, but please maybe in 1 or 2 minutes maximum.
Okay, then it won't be a concluding comment, but perhaps something that I've seen that someone asked in the chat, how the small countries are actually reacting to that, right? I think that's a legitimate question, very important one. And because my minute is almost over, I can just tell you that there is some development in Estonia. I mean, I think in the summer, there was the Estonian defense minister saying that Estonia is ready to host British aircraft with nuclear components. So there are some small steps taken by the small countries, but definitely there is nothing comparable in terms of reaction to the Polish reaction, simply because many of the Baltic countries, I think none of them has actually air force. So it's difficult to actually, be a credible partner on that. But there's more research to be done on that. And I hope that within the next 6 months, I can definitely share some data on how the smaller states see the nuclear escalation that is currently happening between Russia and the NATO countries. Thanks for having me, and I will stop here.
Amazing, thank you very much. So Linde, you have a question on war game. So
yes.
If you don't mind, maybe you can also address that question.
Yes. Hello, Vanessa. Thank you for the question. So I'm wondering whether you want to know how I would respond or how I think others will respond, because that might not necessarily be the same. And so, I mean, first, depends the context within which you can assume that this would happen within the context of a larger campaign. So I do think there's some contextual variables to take into account. Nonetheless, from what we kind of know from some discussions that have kind of leaked or have been reported upon within the US context is precisely that there's no agreement on this, that there were some kind of simulations of Russian tactical attacks on a NATO country under the Obama administration, where lower level officials suggested to respond with the conventional forces, whereas cabinet level officials were perhaps more willing to respond with a nuclear weapon, specifically targeting Belarus then. So this scenario has been somewhat discussed in the press. But then when it comes to specifically the Biden administration, some nitbits of what the thinking there was. There are also an interview of him with the New York Times where he very much makes the point that he doesn't think that a limited nuclear strike or a limited nuclear war is very possible, that it would go straight to Armageddon. So that does seem to suggest that the Biden administration would have leaned more towards a conventional response as well. So I think there's probably going to be variation in how countries and even subsections of countries, what their preferences would be. If I personally were the leader of the world, which is not something I aspire for, but if you ask how I would advise to respond, then my reaction would be to seek to diplomatically isolate Russia for sure, but to respond with conventional force. I hope that's an answer to your question.
I hope, but I think that's a brilliant and concluding comment on that. So over to you, Julie, and I hope that I never missed any questions from the chat, but yeah, just please feel free to.
Yeah. I love when a final remark starts like, if I was the leader of the world. I think this is, that says so much about the panel. But yeah, no, we have a question from Paul that says, should Europe pursue nuclear autonomy versus relying on the US? Quite frankly, as it stands today, I don't think it's even a question. I don't think we have the choice. You know, like it's not, do we want to be autonomous or do we want to be part of the US or nuclear umbrella, whatever you call that? We do what we can at the moment, I think. We have 2 nuclear armed states in Europe, 2 of them being what we will call middle power, with limited fundings, limited resources, with very peculiar domestic views on nuclear weapons. Minimum deterrence theory does not allow for increasing nuclear warheads quickly. We don't have the finances, we don't have the domestic mindset, so it's not so much right now an option. Regardless of what some people might think or not, we need the US for this European architecture. The game for the leaders at the moment is to build something that it's realistic, something that can complement NATO on the conventional and nuclear side, but something that it's not seen to the US as an invitation to take off. So it's about, right now, the biggest challenge is politic. It's about communicating this need to go out and be a little bit more independent without opening the door for an invitation for them to leave. So yeah, I hope it kind of like answered the question.
Excellent. And Valentina, would you like also address the very last questions in addition to your concluding remark?
So yes, I would agree with Julie that the idea of nuclear autonomy for Europe is a bit ambitious, in the sense, as Julie said, we do what we can. I think we need to be realistic about what European states can and cannot do. I think we need to think about as well, which European states are we talking about and which Europe are we talking about. So are we talking about, now our discussion has primarily revolved around NATO and NATO's force posture and NATO, the member states' concerns. But we also need to remember that that Europe is also made up of non-NATO states, right? So, for example, the country I come from, Malta, is the epitome of a small state, is the epitome of a neutral European state, like Austria, like Ireland, like Switzerland, and their agenda on these issues is very, very different to that of NATO member states. And I think what we can also think about is that the nuclear agenda also goes beyond deterrence, no? So there's a lot in terms of non-proliferation, in terms of arms control, there's in terms of disarmament. And I think we can think about also how can Europe contribute to that wider debate and that wider discussion. So especially when it comes to the non-proliferation, the NPT review processes, where are the stumbling blocks and where is it stalling, and what can European member states doing to contribute to that. We know that there is the TPNW agenda, which the small European neutrals that I mentioned, like Malta, Ireland, Austria, are pushing and have ratified and are advocates of. So Europe, in a sense, can be seen as a bit of a sort of a tapestry of those different interests, the larger states, the middle powers, which I'm sure they wouldn't like to be called, like UK and France, but even what sort of the nuclear dependent states are concerned about. And I think in that respect, we can really try and take advantage of sort of the outreach that the different realities and the different interests, the outreach that is capable within the many member states or the many European states to try and sort of further the discussion beyond just deterrence, but also looking at diplomacy and disarmament and non-proliferation discussions. And the final comment, I think I would agree with Linde as well, that the discussions have shown that I think there is a reluctance as well for nuclear use, and I think that the studies that I had looked at as well in terms of the war games that were carried out, both academically and politically, looked at a more conventional approach and sort of attempts at risk reduction rather than escalation. And I think the Ukraine war in that respect is an excellent example of that stability-instability paradox and how it would play out in Europe.
I think that's a great ending of this roundtable. So many thanks to all participants for sharing your comments and questions. And I hope that we cover all of them. But if not, please kindly reach out to our speakers. So nuclear scholar, nuclear community is small. So I think that everyone more or less know each other. And I think it's good that we all stay in touch with one another. But deeply grateful to 4 speakers who kindly shared their insight. I took many notes, and I think I have much food for thoughts and also so many interesting and intriguing ideas. I deeply appreciate for your availability and also sharing your insight. That was some very great and engaging conversations. And last but not least, I really need to appreciate and acknowledge all supports and efforts by ECPR and the Loop. That's a very small team, but they are very dedicated and very professional. And I really appreciate each and every person who supported me for running the blog series, but at the same time for organizing this event, particularly Abby, who was behind the scene, but she kindly supported throughout the event, but also days and weeks prior to this roundtable. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate all comments, all engagements, and very much looking forward to continuing our conversations. Thank you.